I remember the first time I saw phosphorus in my life back in 1993. It was my grandparents' house in South Lebanon. Of course, I didn't know what it was. I went to call someone from the UNIFIL. They said, look, this is all banned.
What year was that?
That was 1993. They estimated some 14 billion for reconstruction and another 12 billion to repair everything that will need to be put back to sleep. So we're talking about a huge figure.
What should the role of the Lebanese government be in this reconstruction?
One needs to see the government now taking very concrete steps to secure the funding. The Lebanese citizens in South Lebanon need today to feel that the government is there for them.
Lebanon's current building and zoning regulations make it impossible for many people who lost their homes to construct them.
People were caught between, on the one hand, residents saying we want to build our homes, and at the time the Prime Minister who was saying, you know, you can't rebuild your homes because you're illegal. So now, in the fight against Hezbollah, the Prime Minister is criminalizing the residents of the area. And Hezbollah jumps to posit itself as the defender of these people. وين الدولة? Where is the state?
Welcome everyone to the 14th episode of Real Talk. Our deep dive into Lebanon continues this week with a discussion on the mounting reconstruction crisis following the destruction caused by months of unprecedented aerial bombardment by Israel in its unbridled and unprecedented relentless pursuit of Hezbollah, whatever the cost to human life, history, heritage and humanity. Before we get into it, I would like to graciously thank you all for your growing interest in our podcast and humbly thank those who are financially supporting our efforts in providing you with independent, unbiased journalism without fear or favour. Your contributions of $5 a month is truly appreciated. I've been a member of the international media for more than 40 years now, and I have witnessed many challenges to our freedom of speech. But I must say I have never seen our rights, your right to be heard and provided with the truth and facts, more compromised than it is today. No major media organisation in the world today is telling it as it is, especially in regards to Gaza, the Palestinian disaster, international law and the atrocities and wars that persist globally. So it does take individuals and independents like myself and many others to go out there on their own, at their own expense, to stand up for true journalism, to deliver you the truth so you can decide. Some say people can't handle the truth. I say that's a lie. Innately, we all know the truth. Instinctively, we know it too. We are waiting for our alleged leaders, the institutions who claim to represent the truth, to own up to their failure to take responsibility. They have lost all respect and meaning in our eyes. We will never trust them again the way we did in the past. We still need to know what's going on, and I'm grateful I can at least do my part to present to you my take on world affairs and present you with ethical, intelligent experts who can help shed light on the stories we are investigating. Apologies for that long-winded intro, but I felt it needed to be said. So thank you again for your faith and trust in my views and your support. Today, the main themes that we will be discussing include the scale of destruction of Lebanon by the most recent war on it by Israel, the role of the Lebanese government to lead the reconstruction effort, the laws and regulations, and if they're adequate or deficient, and the funding of that reconstruction. Before I introduce today's guest, let me provide you with some context. The war on Lebanon lasted 13 months, 2 weeks and 5 days. It resulted in over 4,000 people, mostly innocent civilians, being killed and more than 16,000 injured. According to a report published by Jihad al-Bina, a Hezbollah association, the total number of housing units to be restored as of January 2025 has reached a staggering 268,317 in 448 villages and towns. In Beirut alone, 353 buildings were obliterated, with 593 severely damaged, of which 120 are expected to be fully destroyed, and 5,417 others suffering significant, moderate or minor damage. compared to 265 destroyed and 951 damaged in 2006. According to a leaked report by the World Bank, reconstruction is expected to cost $14 billion. This is beyond the $124 million in damage caused to Lebanon's agriculture and the $1.1 billion in losses to the sector. As for the environment, it is estimated that Lebanon suffered $221 million in damages and an additional $214 million in losses for the sector. Drawing comparisons to the 2006 war are in vain, with this war doubling, if not tripling, the amount of damage caused to Lebanon. What now for Lebanon? How does Lebanon rebuild? Where do we get the money? What's happening with the people? Well, today we're joined by one of Lebanon's most authoritative voices in this field, Mona Fawaz. Welcome, Mona.
Good afternoon, and thank you for really your pursuit of truth.
Thank you very much, Mona. It's a duty, honestly, if you take your job seriously. That's my role, and the role that the team I've got around me feel is our responsibility.
I'm happy to be here.
I would love to introduce you now to our audience, our viewers, and our listeners, to provide them with the depth of your experience and knowledge on this topic. Professor Fawaz is a prominent Lebanese scholar in urban studies and planning at the distinguished American University of Beirut. She co-founded the Beirut Urban Lab, a research centre dedicated to fostering inclusive and sustainable urbanisation in the region. Professor Fawaz's academic journey began with a Bachelor of Architecture from the AUB. She furthered her studies at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston, where she earned both a master's and a PhD in city planning. Her research encompasses urban history, social and spatial justice, informality and the law, land and housing policies, and urban planning practices. She has authored over 50 scholarly works in multiple languages, and she is aptly qualified to speak on this topic. Welcome again, Professor Fawaz, and thank you for inviting us to join you at your offices at the AUB.
Thank you for coming all the way here and braving Beirut's traffic.
Yes, definitely braving is the key word here. Quite an experience. Let's get into it, shall we?
Of course.
So the first theme we want to get into is a scale of Lebanon's destruction. Various estimates are circulating regarding the extent of Israel's destruction in Lebanon. Based on the figures I've outlined in my intro, how would you evaluate the scale of damage Lebanon has suffered in this recent conflict? And are the reported figures reliable? In your opinion, is the estimated $14 billion cost of reconstruction accurate, overstated, or underestimated?
That's an important question. It's definitely true that it's been very hard to do an assessment, and one of the main reasons is that Israel delayed, although the ceasefire was signed at the end of November, Israel delayed pulling out for a couple more months, and so it was very difficult to do the assessments, and relying on aerial photographs and other technologies is not as accurate as doing the survey. As you pointed out as well, a lot of buildings are partially destroyed and need sound structural assessments to be able to know whether they're repairable or not. Sometimes the cost of repair is higher than pulling down the building and actually bringing a new one. So return has been slow, and with it also surveys and assessments. We know that there are major discrepancies in the counts. We've tried to compare the figures in the southern suburbs of Beirut that was first accessible to us. And we've heard numbers all the way from 400 to 1,000 building that needs to be fully replaced. We know that for Jihad al-Bina, which is the organization that works for Hezbollah, there is an interest in reducing the numbers, because then you can claim, if you're being blamed for having triggered the war, you can reduce the numbers. Conversely, we also know that others have an interest in raising the numbers because it shows that this is a huge and dramatic thing. What we know for sure, comparing the figures and the numbers, is that at least in the southern suburbs of Beirut, we are at least 3 times more than what we had back in 2006. We also know that the pattern of the damage is really different. In 2006, Israel destroyed the core of Har Tahrik, which is where Hezbollah's bureau was, and with it, it destroyed 220 multi-story residential buildings. So these were stores, homes that they thought were part of the neighborhood that was supportive in their eyes to the party. Of course, that meant really destroying people's livelihoods. but they were all in the same location. And so it was possible to imagine a reconstruction where one company can come and redesign the neighborhood, work it, and build it. Today, the destruction is everywhere. It's spread out across the entire suburbs, and the suburbs have grown considerably. So it'll be much harder to have one project through which you actually can coordinate this destruction. In the south, the destruction is not only homes. Of course, there's all the infrastructure. We don't think about it, but that's the water, the electricity, the sewer networks, everything that allows people to come back. In fact, if you've been following Human Rights Watch reports, the UN reports, they're all saying people are unable to stay in the south because they actually don't have the infrastructure to be able to survive the winter. And these will also be huge things to grapple with. I also want to point to the villages on the borders of Lebanon that have been bulldozed. We haven't been able to see them yet because they're right up the frontier where the Israeli army still has an established presence. But these are historical old towns that were nested in the villages, in the mountains and in the landscape. They very much represent a very important heritage of South Lebanon. That's our architecture. It also existed, incidentally, in Palestine, and in 1948, those villages were bulldozed by the Israelis, and then eventually the Israelis planted on the side of Palestine pine trees, because pine is an acidic tree. And so when the pine tree falls on the ground, it transforms the quality of the nature, the kind of greeneries that you have, and it allowed them to create this tabula rasa, so that when you look from Lebanon towards historic Palestine now, you see basically these settlements that look very much like American suburbs, and it's an interruption in the natural landscape and the historical continuity. In South Lebanon now, we have an area that's been bulldozed with these villages systematically destroyed, and these will be extremely hard to rebuild. All in all, the damage is definitely daunting. That's also, in UN estimates, more than a quarter of the schools in South Lebanon, over 80% of the electricity, at least a third of water facilities. So we're really talking about a substantial loss of infrastructures.
So the figure of 14 billion by the World Bank, which is a part of a leaked report, because it first put its estimate 8.5 billion in, I think, October last year, before the end of the war. But, you know, some say that it's increased that, but we still don't know if that figure is going to be the final figure, really, do we?
Yes, like you, I saw the leaked numbers that came out from the governmental meeting. The World Bank usually releases its numbers and the methodologies that they follow, so we should be able to see them in a few days. They estimated some 14 billion for reconstruction and another 12 billion to repair everything that will need to be put back to sleep. So we're talking about a huge figure, especially because Lebanon is bankrupt, because the financing is going to be slow, and because the Lebanese population in general has been really impoverished by the 5 years of financial meltdown. So we'll talk at the end about the financing, but that's going to be really a figure to keep in mind, thinking that Lebanon is in debt, and most Lebanese citizens have lost basically all their savings in with the national bankruptcy, and will not be able to put forward their own funding the same way they would have back in 2006.
Definitely. What forms of destruction in Lebanon are irreparable or long-term? Additionally, could you discuss the impact of Israel's use of the illegal and prohibited white phosphorus gas on areas in the south on the prolonged recovery for Lebanon?
Yes. I mean, I remember the first time I saw phosphorus in my life back in 1993. It was in my grandparents' house in South Lebanon. It was on the steps, and of course I didn't know what it was, but we had found a live bomb that didn't explode, and I went to call someone from the UNIFIL that's positioned in our village, and as they were coming up the stairs, they said, "Look, this is all banned." And I'm like, you're looking at the UN, and you're like, "What is this?" And they explained to you, "This is phosphorus." So they knew the material. They were experts. We weren't.
What year was that?
That was 1993.
Wow.
So since then, There is evidence that's documented. There are reports that show that Israel has been using these weapons, and still someone is selling Israel these weapons, or at least the material to produce these weapons. So it's really a collective responsibility, and it's not something new that Israel's using phosphorus or other bans. Back in 2006 and in 96, they also used cluster bombs that are also illegal. And for a very long time, we couldn't go down and collect and pick our olives because we were afraid of the cluster bombs and we were waiting for the land to be clean. So this repeated documented use of these internationally banned weapons is not new, and we shouldn't just associate it with this last moment. In fact, the war is not over. The Israelis are still occupying South Lebanon, so we don't know what will be used tomorrow or the day after. And I think this is really important to keep in mind as we think about reconstruction. So colleagues here at AUB have documented the use of phosphorus in a lot of agricultural lands that will require treatment that is very expensive. It's not irreparable, but it will require treatment that is very expensive.
What is the damage that white phosphorus does? Can you explain that?
I would not be able to point it out exactly.
But we know how it impacts human beings when they come in contact with it, and how searing, and it goes deep into the bone. It burns severely. So we can imagine the damage it does to the soil, to the trees, to the whole environmental area.
Yes, and we've seen pictures of trees that are dead, and we know that there's enough in-depth losses that it is calling on experts to come even from abroad and try to produce the studies to be able to assess the long-term damage.
And they did it also just on the olive groves that you mentioned. They intentionally poisoned basically with the white phosphorus, the olive groves, so because it's a source of income and sustainability for the people.
Large agricultural fields. And the impact is not just for this season, because not only will the phosphorus stay on the land and will require major treatment, but even where they didn't use it, the fact that they've prevented people from going and picking the olives sends a signal to the trees. And it's the olives, it's also the pomegranate and everything else that grows during this season in South Lebanon. Once you haven't picked your trees, the tree gets a signal, the next year it's less fertile. So it's a long-term impact of which we also have seen them practice in the West Bank and elsewhere, right? Trying to depopulate areas.
Absolutely, absolutely. Their modus operandi is very clear, where they have done it and tried it in the West Bank and in Gaza. Gaza is now a wasteland. But yes, we've suffered, Lebanon has suffered for decades, but obviously not anywhere near the extent that the Palestinians have suffered.
Yeah.
Let me roll into the second theme now, the role of the government in reconstruction. One of Lebanon's long-standing issues has been the government's failure to lead reconstruction efforts following major disasters, wars or crises, as witnessed following the Civil War, the 15-year Civil War, the 2006 war, and Lebanon port blast in 2020. Instead, we witnessed, and to quote you, the consistent practice of state agencies' delegation, coordination and regulatory roles to non-state actors, be they private, non-profit or political actors. And this led, and I quote you again, to scattered and divisive recovery efforts orchestrated by rivaling actors, which place citizens in competition with each other over meagre financial compensations and or directed them towards patrons who could guarantee the legal protections and financial resources needed to rebuild their homes. Other experts on this topic, no doubt people you are very familiar with, including architect Abir Saksouk, co-founder of the urban research platform Public Works Studio, stated in a recent article in Laurent Le Jour, we must not allow this reconstruction to resemble the one after 2006, which was to the detriment of the state. And also architect and urban planner Serge Yaziki, in the same article, stated reconstruction is a political act that should be conceived in the long term and work to bring the citizen back into the state's fold. Let's explore that, if you don't mind. Please explain and be specific, name names, organisations, companies, etc. Let's not beat around the bush on this topic because it's very critical. How did they do this? Who did this? Why did they do this? Why did they basically subcontract their role, the government, over the last few decades? subcontract their role and responsibility to private entities, and who benefited? I know there's a lot in there, but really just tell us that story.
I mean, I think it starts with understanding who is the state in Lebanon. And if you remember during the war, we had the head of the parliament, Nabih Berri, say, وين الدولة? Where is the state? And people say, I mean, if you're the head of parliament and you've been the head of parliament since the end of the civil war and you're coming out to tell us, where is the state? I want to ask you, what did you do to the state? And if we look at what has happened to the state of Lebanon since the beginning of the civil war and until today, it has been a process of capture by different political actors and parties that have each sort of latched on a piece of the state and used it in order to reproduce their own sectarian power. So we're not born Lebanese sectarian, but we learn to get our job, get our food, get our relief through this mechanism. So benefits you distribute are access to water, electricity, employment in the army, employment as a school teacher. The Lebanese state is the biggest employer in Lebanon, and that employment goes through a limited number of actors who actually determine who will get these benefits. And in exchange of these benefits, you will see when you go to elections, to any municipal or national election, you will even see old people being dragged, and you ask them, like, why are you coming to vote? You're worried that your hero is not going to be elected, and then you find out that they have someone they need to employ. So that kind of use of the state of Lebanon means that the people in power not only use the state, but they also entrench their power socially through it. But they're also on the side, many of them, businessmen. So they're the bankers who actually got the country to go bankrupt. They own the real estate companies that are building empty homes to store wealth when people are desperate for their right to housing to be enacted. So if we begin to deconstruct the state of Lebanon from the ideal that we aspire to have and that we have been fighting for decades to have, and instead understand it as this sort of octopus of actors, then it becomes clear why they would want to delegate it. And it begins since 1990. The epitome is the construction of the Beirut's historic core. This is the city's capital historic core. This is not a neighborhood in the far suburbs that you can turn into a gated community. It was made into a real estate company, the design of which was delegated to a private company.
We're talking about Solidaire?
We're talking about Solidaire. And Solidaire is owned by then Prime Minister, the late Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, and then a number of bankers and other large-scale investors. But it also sold shares. So the reconstruction of the historic core of Lebanon's capital is accountable to the profit of the shareholders and not the citizens of Lebanon. And you cannot blame Solidaire. Solidaire is a company, it has a board that manages it, that's accountable to its shareholders. You have to blame the public authority, which is in and by itself intricately connected to it, that actually delegated our reconstruction and made it accountable to the profit of a few and not the interest of Lebanese citizens. It also divides the citizens now between those who have an entrenched interest in creating a speculative agency that will make profit by selling real estate, and between all the citizens who need a historic core that has markets, employment opportunities, places to live, places to encounter other Lebanese population groups, so that that social mixity that we knew to be Lebanon's sort of uniqueness, right, is also recovered through the recovery of the historic core. And we went on, one reconstruction after the other, delegating to actors who would benefit financially from it, but also reducing every time the interest of the state. We can talk about 2006, again, the reconstruction of Beirut's southern suburbs. What we see is the state basically represented by the national government in a standoff against Hezbollah, that it was Hezbollah's responsibility to have destroyed the southern suburbs. Now, if you lived in the southern suburbs of Beirut, you're now in a very weak position because you want to rebuild your home and you're afraid you won't be able to. You don't have the money, you don't have the legal framework, we can talk about it. And so then you eventually are forced to hide behind Hezbollah that will come and say, I will rebuild your neighborhood, and it will create its own private agency. Why was Har Tahrir destroyed? Because the Israeli army claimed that this was the headquarters of Hezbollah. Although it really wasn't just that. It may have housed the headquarters of Hezbollah, it did, but it also housed hundreds of people who had homes and businesses that they lost. Now, when the government allows this to happen and Hezbollah rebuilds itself the neighborhood, now it's really entrenched the effect of the war. It has become the stronghold of Hezbollah.
And the indebtedness of the people is to the party, not to the state.
Absolutely. And that transforms. And when we think of, like, that transforms completely people's relations to each other. And we talk about what is Reconstruction, right? Reconstruction is not the rebuilding of 220 buildings. It's not the sum of the homes. It is a community, and it's a community in its relationship to each other and to the state that is supposed to be the custodian of the common good. Now, when we went to interview people in Har Tahrir back in 2006, Nasrallah had told them, the head of Hezbollah then, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, had told them, Har Tahrir will be rebuilt more beautiful than it was, right? أجمل مما كانت. So I went with my students and we asked people, Sayyid Hassan said more beautiful than it was. What is more beautiful? And people really unanimously would say more green spaces, more wider sidewalks, places where I can push my stroller, somewhere where my kids can go and play. So universally, the desire was for improving shared open spaces, what brings the community together. And then there was this meeting for everyone that the party did, for the property owners, to agree with them how to rebuild the neighborhood. And he told them, أجمل مما كانت, more beautiful than it was, means cladded buildings, you'll have your private generator, you'll have new kitchens, new bathrooms, and then people were involved in the private, and after that date, you can see the interviews, they switch, and people start saying, it means our buildings are going to be cladded with stone, we're going to have our own private generator, and so we lost that communal shared imaginary. Same problem in 2020. And there, it's really the mistake of the international community, because the Lebanese citizens had, remember, revolted against their government, been unable to displace the government, and we wanted, after the explosion of the port, to rebuild differently. But the activists were saying, my government did this, and so the international mood was to basically delegate the reconstruction to non-governmental organizations. And that is catastrophic, because now you have all these little organizations, each rebuilding on its own standards. That was also what we saw in 2006, and we can talk more about it if you're interested. But when you delegate either to the Qatar or the Kuwait or the Saudi fund, or if you delegate to any NGO, ANERA, NRC, DRC, everyone is well-meaning, and we are grateful for the help. But then you're negotiating with an NGO a different package from your fellow neighbor who's negotiating a different package. So where's the equity? Where's the equity between citizens? Where is the sense that there's going to be something fair, right? So instead, people begin to compete. I want this country to sponsor my village, not this country, because, you know, Qatar is more generous than Syria. So in Sadiqin in 2006, people went to protest because it was Syria that had sponsored their town, and they actually wanted the Qatar fund that was much more generous. Can you imagine, like, what kind of citizenship this is actually folding? And the same thing happened after the port blast. We saw people who started in the beginning feeling a sense of a collective, helping each other to pull each other out from under the rubble, to clean each other's home, sheltering each other, eventually fight with each other over the fact that you got the better NGO to fix your house, and you had these people fix your house, it's my turn, don't grab the help. And that becomes a competition from below, and it kills again the relationship to the state, and it makes it
and between each other, between neighbours.
Absolutely.
Creates which is not normal for Lebanese, who are very social and very Jiran is كل شيء, you know, the neighbour is everything. But and still today, the port blast, the impact of the port blast, there are many buildings that still remain, undeveloped, unreconstructed.
or reconstructed and empty. So in the lab where I work, we've set up an observatory for the recovery of the port areas, and we documented who's returning, where is repair. Repair is over 80%. So what really was very late in being repaired are, it's counterintuitive, but the very rich who were fighting with insurance companies to get the money, and those who could afford to just leave. They said, I'm turning my back, I'm not coming back. Low-income dwellers slept on the glass inside their apartments because they had nowhere else to go. That includes the Syrian refugees in Karantina and in Mar Mikhail. So when you track repair, over 80% is repaired, but a lot of houses are empty. And I would argue it's because we again addressed recovery as if it's the sum of individual homes that you fix. But you need to reconcile the collective, you need to invest in shared open spaces, in communal areas that give people a sense that they can collectively rebuild the connection to this area where the trauma happened. And that is not happening.
No, that's not happening.
And that is not happening particularly because the political parties who are powerful in these areas are sowing this division, creating a fear of the collective. When we tried in 2020 to design a small public intervention with a big tree and a widening of the sidewalk with a couple of benches, we interviewed all the elderly people in the buildings around the area, and they were so excited to be able to go back on the street and have a place to actually talk to each other. But then when we started the implementation, of course, we were working with the municipality of Beirut. We had full authorization from the municipal council. So we were collaborating with the public actor to design this intervention. We were stopped by the local forces in the neighborhood who saw the municipality as impinging on their territory and who started telling people who wanted the public space, tomorrow you'll have prostitutes when you have public spaces, you'll have street fights, you'll bring refugees to come sleep on your sidewalks. And they basically turned into bullying people so that people feel that this is scary, no, we shouldn't have a public shared space. And that kind of discourse is what slows down recoveries, right? And to the contrary, consolidates the impact of the blast on the area where it happens. And every single reconstruction or recovery has been this. The terrific act happens, and then the so-called recovery consolidates its impacts.
Lebanese have been described as the most traumatized people in the world, and they just continue to be impacted, and there's no real treatment or addressing of the trauma still to this day. We have seen progress, and there's been a lot of I know people who have been involved in helping with psychology, and NGOs have come in, but it's nowhere near the level that is needed.
Yes, no, I agree.
I want to quickly this might be controversial, we don't need to get into it deeply, but when you were talking about the reconstruction of the heritage area of Beirut, the Beirut area, when the way you were describing it for me, and I was here and I did make a documentary during the 90s, straight after the war, and it's still to this day controversial, and not to to be disrespectful to the former Prime Minister of Hariri. But in all honesty, as we know, it was a real estate project. It became an opportunity for reconstruction, redevelopment, and for those interested in this industry to make a hell of a lot of money.
Yes.
I knew at the time that a lot of the middle class that owned homes in that area, it really decimated them, because they had, and people in the buildings had to sign deals to get 10% of the worth of their property, or I'm not sure what the figures were, but there was unfair and unjust deals that were being done for people to hand over their property. Sadly, it reminds me today of what we're looking at in Gaza with President Trump wanting to take over Gaza. America takes over Gaza and redevelops, the beachfront property land. This is a problem. This is a problem that, it's people might get upset that I'm, likening Hariri to Trump, but in reality and factually, it is very similar. Although Hariri is from the land and the people who own the property who participate in the companies that benefited are Lebanese. America is completely external and a foreign player. I'm not saying it's identical, but anyway, it's something I wanted to throw in there.
It's interesting. So let's first say that the comparison has a lot of problematic aspects, right? Not the least of which is that Gaza has been bombed by Israel in an effort to ethnically cleanse it, and that then the real estate instinct of turning it into a so-called Riviera comes to consolidate ethnic cleansing. So I don't think we want to bring this to Lebanon. On the other hand, I fully concur that the positionality of the real estate developer and the idea that land is conceived as abstract. So when we think of land as something, especially, the Palestinian cause, right? And also Beirut's historic core. It's a land that speaks. It has a history. It doesn't exist outside of the experiences of the people who put their labor in it, of the memories that people invested in it, the stories, and the people who grew from it. And to basically abstract land and deal with it as if it's something you can like an abstract commodity that you can trace, just like money. And that's what's crazy. It's not even the smug I like. It's $100 that so many people can actually use and transact. And that's how we're dealing with land. And that's how we dealt with Beirut's historic core. So there was an abstraction. And then there was a kind of preference for some kind of heritage, which is beautiful. And I don't want to take away anything from the architectural skill of the Lebanese urban designers and architects who intervened in the design of Beirut's historic core, because the work was absolutely extraordinary. But if it's a proof of anything, it's that urban planning and urban design don't exist outside of the economic political framework that sets them in place. And what we saw in Beirut's historic core is a transfer of wealth, a massive transfer of wealth. And it also set Lebanon on this process that the way we make money is by selling pieces of our city. And that's not an economically viable solution. And I'm so glad you're raising this issue now, because when we're listening to the new government, right, the bright new government, and we're so excited that we have a very competent and honest and promising prime minister, and yet when we're listening to the discourse that is coming about real estate, again, we have this imaginary that what we want to do is recover selling land. And that is exactly what put us on that transfer of wealth and our inability to become an economically productive country that can retain its children and allow them to imagine a future in it. We turned our country into a place where we sell land and we export youth. We really need to turn it around.
Definitely. And that leads straight into my next question, and I was going to get into the government, but what generally should the role of government be in reconstruction after such events? We see it around the world, major crises, emergency situations, tragedies, government gets in, emergency laws are passed. What should the role of the Lebanese government be involved in this reconstruction?
The reconstruction is huge. And so there is no way that one actor can actually take it on. So let's start from the beginning. We have a very vibrant private sector. We have a great nonprofit sector. They should also be involved. We need a synergy between the public, the private, and the nonprofit actors. We need to empower residents to be able to rebuild their homes. And the government needs to be the coordinator and the facilitator. You expect also for the government to be able to secure the funds and to negotiate them and to disperse them in a way that's equitable and ideally that allows citizens to recreate a relationship with that state. And let's not forget that if the South Lebanese indeed endorsed Hezbollah and its resistance to Israel, it is because Hezbollah was born out of the occupation of South Lebanon and people experienced Hezbollah as the resistance that kicked the Israelis out. The Lebanese citizens in South Lebanon need today to feel that the government is there for them, that it is their interlocutor, that it is looking to secure the funding, and that through this reconstruction, we begin to recover and mend that relationship between citizens and the state. That's incredibly important. So one needs to see the government now taking very concrete steps to secure the funding, but also to disperse it in an equitable way, and putting in place a regulatory framework that empowers people to rebuild their homes. Again, I know Har Tahrik and the southern suburbs of Beirut more than the other cases of reconstruction, but we know that in our rules and regulations, whether it's the South Lebanon or Beqa villages that were built before the building law was set in place, or the southern suburbs of Beirut that was built during the civil war, none of these areas is illegal because they've been regularized through various deals, or because they exist before the law was even in place in the case of the villages of South Lebanon. But none of them can be rebuilt as they were in the regulatory framework that is in place today.
We're going to jump into that next.
It's a modern regulatory framework, right? Yeah. So I'm getting a little bit ahead, sorry, but it's important because when your legal framework prevents people from being able to rebuild their homes, then they're going to go to the strong party who can brave your law. And that's how Hezbollah was able to rebuild the southern suburbs of Beirut.
From a high level, the government should be
set in place rules, laws that empower people, protect heritage, right? Because you need to also protect that identity, and we'll talk about it in a second, but that's really important. So we expect the national government to immediately issue laws that empower residents to be able to build their homes, but also to be present to make sure that the distribution of compensations, the repair of infrastructure has public agencies at the forefront of how they do. And when the competence doesn't exist, that it uses the recovery as a strategy to also build that competence within the institutions of the state, not create parallel institutions or just delegate because it's an emergency. We've been in a state of emergency for 50 years. What makes you think that the next 5 years are not going to be an emergency? We should, as fast as possible, build the institutions of the state in a way that they can actually respond to that emergency and be the resilience we need.
Getting into the new government of Nawaf Salam, they've issued their ministerial statement and they're discussing it through Parliament today and tomorrow. It appears to have reconstruction as one of its primary objectives, stating that the government will work swiftly to reconstruct what was devastated by Israeli aggression, repair the damage, and finance these efforts through a dedicated and transparent fund. This initiative aims to reassure citizens that the state stands by them without discrimination. Does this statement give you renewed hope that maybe this government is going to start doing things differently and take its responsibilities seriously? Will this engender trust in the new government and away from sectarian parties? You've been you mentioned you're skeptical because you're listening to some of the statements coming out right now. Are you skeptical as to their ability to change the process, change what the past?
I'll say that I'm cautiously optimistic.
Okay, that's good.
I don't think a month ago we would have imagined to have someone from the caliber and the profile of Nawaf Salam as Prime Minister. And I think this gives me a lot of hope that things that we don't expect come out of nowhere sometimes, but actually out of a lot of struggle. I mean, we were on the street for months putting forward Nawaf Salam's very name actually as one option. What inspires me and gives me hope is that Salam doesn't present himself as a sectarian Zaim. And that's a massive change in our system. In fact, we're seeing the sectarian Zaim pop up and try to reclaim the space, right? And we saw a lot of critiques after the formation of this specific cabinet by the Zaim saying, the Christians didn't get to say who the Christians are. Why don't the Shiites get to say who the Shiites are? So we saw that same dynamic being pushed at us. And we saw that there was resistance to it, true resistance to it, within the confines of what the kind of elected parliament we have right now can allow for it to happen. We also see in the nominations some names that are absolutely inspiring, that come outside, that are people who have struggled for many years. I'll mention my colleague Rima Karami, who's the Minister of Education. I mean, I couldn't, if I closed my eyes 2 months ago and you told me who would be the best Minister of Education ever, I would have said Rima. Someone involved with the public university, someone involved with public schools, someone who has vision, who's been writing documents about it. So it's totally great to see these individuals in the right place. And she's not alone. On the other hand, yes, I had question marks and things that I believe are absolutely critical to be starting points where we know that the ministers have conflict of interests in them. Chief among them for me as a planner, right? I mean, so I'm speaking as a city planner. I think that there are two things that we absolutely need to prioritize over anything else. The recovery of the social value of land, because land is not an asset only. It is an asset, it's normal, but it's also a place to live, a place to work, a place where people can meet, where people can laugh, where people can have fun, where kids can play and grow. And that social value of land, which many countries around the world have now recognized in their constitutions, we continue to limit it and to imagine it and to discursively pronounce it as an asset and to say that private property trumps everything, which is not true in our constitution. Yes, we protect private property, but it doesn't mean that we don't respect public property or that our people don't have a space. This was in the constitutional formation text of Lebanon. So we need to emphasize that, and I worry when I see that discourse about real estate and when I see that the decision makers are themselves developers. The other piece that as a city planner, again, I think is incredibly important is public mobility. We need to move with public transportation. You took 1 hour to get to an appointment this afternoon. 2 hours. I'm so sorry.
It's not your fault at all.
Absolutely. But it's insane that in a city which is so small, that was developed around public transportation. Beirut grew historically, for those of us who know it well, it grew historically around the public transportation networks, the road to Damascus, the road to Saida, the road to Tripoli. These were public. There was no private cars. So the city has a full possibility to actually be developed around public networks and to endorse transit-oriented development for its future growth. But sadly, our Minister of Public Works is actually a car dealer. And it's difficult to have faith that he's going to be sensitive, right, to public mobility. I hope I'm wrong. I don't know him. I don't want to condemn him. But I would have wanted a champion of public mobility to be a Minister of Public Works. So there's things like this that give me a sense of alarm. I'll say one more thing that gives me a very big sense of alarm related to Reconstruction. When the financial meltdown happened in 2019, I noticed something that was very interesting. Suddenly, all of us, me included, went back to our instincts that we had grown up with during the Civil War, which is basically an instinct of repair. So when your washing machine is not working, you go find someone to fix it. You don't replace it. When your skirt is torn, you go look for someone to do it. When you gain some weight, you look for someone to fix it. And that was something we had lost as a practice. Because the financial currency was subsidized, people weren't paying the right price of things, there was an insane consumerism in the country. And 2019 brought us back to that instinct of repair, which is critical. And you would have wanted that this war, that we approach the rubble, the first element of the war, from the very same instinct. And my colleague who teaches here in civil engineering does a lot of work showing and arguing that the rubble can be recycled, that it can be cleaned, that it can be reused. But there was a huge rush to think about how we're going to use the rubble and dump it again in the sea. Why? Because we create more real estate, more square meters. That's exactly what we did in 2006. We dumped the rubble in the sea, and we built even more real estate. After the port blast, there were many arguments put forward by global experts about the fact that the port area was way too large for what it was serving. And that because the port had grown separately from the city and had been fenced, there was a lot of dead areas, but there was also a destruction of the relationship between the city and the port. Remember, Beirut is a port city. Beirut only grew and got its place in the Mediterranean because it got the first quarantine and because its port expanded, because it's a port city. So the idea of recovering this position as a port city, rebuilding the city-port relation, using the port area to create employment for our youth, was at the top of the arguments I was making, but also that global experts were actually making for the national government. But what we saw was, again, a rush of people who said, oh, we have these square meters, we can build some high-end towers and sell some real estate. And you get to the point where you're like, you know what, lock it down. Forget it, but don't sell it. Please don't sell it. This is a public asset. If our generation is incapable of handling it, let's at least leave it for our kids. Maybe there'll be better days. So today, as we look at this new government, is the new statement up to my aspirations? No, it could have been much stronger. It could have talked way more about accountability. I think we're a country that has been horrific at holding anyone accountable about anything. But still, I am cautiously optimistic because it did put on the table things we had not seen before. And because the priority of the reconstruction and the realization that the government should champion this reconstruction is absolutely critical.
And maybe those bigger topics and more, detailed issues may be raised over time, but I think, it needs to be they need to be continuously reminded of those issues.
Yes.
But the first step is to rebuild and get people back home, but doing it the right way.
Yes.
And that's really critical. I wanted to just touch quickly before we jump into the third theme of regulations, just on you have already spoken about it in today's interview about the open spaces. You're an advocate for open spaces and rebuilding in a way that preserves the collective memory. I want to quote, you mentioned something in one of your articles, a lack of attention to the historical character of the towns that are being rebuilt, the architectural typologies native of the cities and towns that were erased, and the natural landscapes that characterize them threaten to sever permanently the memory of these places and consequently the bonds that keep together their residents. And you've touched on this, and I think that, in talking about the importance of what you do and the people in your industry and space do, this is where the government needs to engage with experts like yourself so that they can understand. And if you're mentioning that the current minister for this industry, this area is a car dealer, what hope is there of him understanding the importance of those factors that you've raised?
Well, we have faith in our Minister of Culture. He definitely has been a long-term champion of our culture, so have several actually members of the current cabinet. So I think they are sensitive to heritage, to the built heritage, and I am confident they will champion the preservation of heritage wherever it's possible. Look, this is really important for Lebanon. And again, urban planning doesn't exist in the abstract. And heritage is not, I like arches, so I want to go and put arches all around. We preserve heritage because heritage is a way of bringing people together. When I walk my kid to school and I show them a building and I say, oh yeah, this is us, my children and other people's children are going to see that building and identify as a collective. And in a country that's been destroyed by civil war and by divisive politics, being able to identify a shared heritage that is us is incredibly important. And so therein comes the importance of protecting that heritage of the South, particularly because the people in the South feel that they're forgotten. They feel they're not part of Lebanon in so many ways. And so being able to inscribe that heritage as part of a national heritage to keep people near their homes, but also to attract others is huge. So I have faith that with with the current Minister of Culture, we can push things on that front more than others. Our main fight is, again, going to be around this idea of the abstraction of land and the fact that for too long we've imagined that the only way we can bring money to this country is by selling pieces of our land, and that we need to begin to invest economically in our heritage, realize that we have a unique landscape. And so if you start thinking about the heritage not as a quick win, a safa, as we say in Arabic, but actually as a long-term investment with bed and breakfast, tourism, that this country has an incredible potential.
You just have to look at countries like Italy and Spain and France and Greece and the history. You drive through their streets and you just see the importance of the preservation that they've undertaken, and why millions of people are drawn to them, to their countries every year. And I often, driving around Lebanon and into the hills, and I actually envision them all tidied up, and I say, this is so European, it's identical, and people would love to see it. So to lose those buildings and structures that take us back hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years, would be a tragedy and would be a loss long-term, like you said, economically, financially. They're going to draw more people in.
Absolutely.
Than selling a piece of land which is gone in one transaction.
Absolutely. You just need to inscribe an understanding of economics as a long-term sustained practice in relation to the land.
Yeah.
Now, I don't want to be completely myopic. There is an Israeli threat south of Lebanon, and the Israeli army is still occupying parts of South Lebanon now, several positions. And that is a major impediment to tourism. And this is where, I feel the international community that keeps on our case and keeps listing us as terrorists and creating all this tension needs to be sensitive to the fact that for this country to be able to realize its economic potential, there's a need of a change of mindset in our government, absolutely, but also there is a need to secure our borders and secure peace. And realize that we've been in a receiving position with a threat of occupation and an expansionist state that now is also occupying parts of Syria. So we really need protection.
Well, we've got to leave it to the new president, former commander-in-chief of the Lebanese army. He's the right man to take charge of that, the security of the country. And God willing, with Nawaf Salam side by side, they can represent the country in a way that previous governments have failed to do so and protect our rights. I'm going to jump into the third theme, the regulations. One of the major issues with Reconstruction, as we've touched on, is the obstacle of regulations. Lebanon's current building and zoning regulations make it impossible for many people who lost their homes to construct them. Can you expand on these regulatory barriers? You touched on them before, but let's go into a little bit with more detail just to give people more knowledge and what the practical realities of this are. How does it impact? What can't people in Dahya, for instance, or the South or the Bekaa rebuild their houses? Why can't they rebuild their houses exactly the way they were? You know where I'm leading.
Yes, well, look, it's very simple. We adopted universal building law, which is sort of the modernist ideal of planning back in the 60s, and people have to file a permit, and anything you build has to comply with the regulations and the geometries of the building law. Unfortunately, in Lebanon, we only have one building law that applies to the whole country with a set of an imaginary of sort of modern volumes. Now, our homes in the Bekaa and in the South, they're hundreds of years old. They're not modern by any standard. And years ago, when we were working in Baalbek with a colleague who's an architect, he pointed out, he said, you notice anytime we're in a place that's illegal, we find it beautiful. And anytime where we find people have followed the building law, we find it horrific. And it's true, because in the regulations of the building law, you can't build those winding streets. You can't base the principle of construction around the idea that you have courtyards that allow for internal lighting. You're basic principle is not privacy and no one overlooks no one's courtyard because that's the way in which people live their lives. I can point to so many rules that you have in these old cities. No one opens two doors facing each other when you're walking in a street to allow for privacy and people to open their windows even to the courtyards and their doors to have cross ventilation in the summer and have natural cooling. There's so many ways in which these forms were thought out in relation to their own practices and habits learned over the years that unfortunately our building law doesn't respect. And so when you get these to be destroyed and people have to file for permits in order to rebuild them, there is a major impediment in being able to build it. Worse, there are people who will take an opportunity to build more because the law sometimes allows them to build higher and more. And the moment one person builds a multi-story residential building in an old winding street, because the law allows them, they have overlooked everyone's courtyard around them and they've destroyed the fabric of the town. And that's what happened in my own village back in 2006. So that's one part of the story. The other part is in areas like the southern suburbs of Beirut. The story is slightly different because these areas were built during the civil war, when Beirut was growing, and again, the building law and the zoning regulations did not recognize these areas as suburbs of the capital city, but actually as villages. And so people built in violation of zoning and building regulations. They built buildings that were high on private property that they owned, but they did not respect the law. And in 1994, we passed what we have done several times, for one time exceptionally, a law that allows people to pay a penalty in exchange of which they become legal. Now, countries do this because the governments need revenue, but also because people have lived in this home for 20 years. What are you going to do now? Kick them out. So people in the southern suburbs of Beirut, particularly Har Tahrik, Burj al Barajne, and Shiyah, had building permits, and now that were legal, and so they could register their property, and they had property titles for their apartments. Only the regularization law says if the building is destroyed, you have to respect the law when you build again. So now you have more people who can claim property than you actually can build. And you need to find a way to allow them to build it. There's the easy way out, which is you say, khalas, we redo what was there. But when you analyze those fabrics, some of these urban fabrics are inadequate. So you have multi-story residential buildings that are built very close to each other, where there's no cross ventilation, where your living room overlooks your neighbor's bathroom. You have a moment where you actually can make a difference in people's lives. And as planners and architects, we know how to move volumes. We're not talking about de-densifying. We're not talking about taking anyone's home. But we have our ways. We place high buildings on corners. We pedestrianize a street, and by doing that, we allow some kind of public space without restricting access to anyone. But that requires changes in regulations. And when this doesn't happen, back in 2006, what happened in the southern suburbs of Beirut is that people were caught between, on the one hand, residents saying we want to build our homes, and at the time, the prime minister, who was saying, you can't rebuild your homes because you're illegal. So now, in the fight against Hezbollah, the prime minister is criminalizing the residents of the area. And Hezbollah jumps to posit itself as the defender of these people, and it establishes WAD as a private company, and it rebuilds the southern suburbs of Beirut. Now, suppose I wanted to build my home, and I go to file a building permit. The municipality doesn't have the authority to allow me to build that building. It's illegal. But Hezbollah doesn't need municipal permission. So it builds the neighborhood. And then after the reconstruction was done, and they invited architects from all over the world to celebrate the great job they did and had an international conference, 2 years later, they passed in parliament a law that allowed people for one time, exceptionally, to rebuild their homes as they were. We did not change the rule. That means that now we need another regulatory framework to rebuild the homes. At the worst, you need to say for one time exceptionally, people can build what they have. Ideally, you would say, let's try to make a little bit of a difference still. So in some cases, there will be an urban design intervention. at least in the areas where a lot of buildings were lost.
Yes. And is there any chance of these laws or someone presenting it like your group or a collection of architects and engineers and urban planners putting forward?
In the research lab where I work, we are championing one intervention for Nabatieh. So we're trying to take the historic core where there's a zoo, and we're trying to put together a project and work with members of the local community to be able to put forward a design. But that's really at the early stages. We have to survey damage, we have to be able to get aerial images, so we're really at the very beginning of it, but we feel that at least if we start the reconstruction from the collective, from the common and not from the private, and we try to understand what is in place, it will be important. Honestly, as an activist, I've been telling people I know in Parliament, pass the exception. But pass it. Empower people to rebuild their homes. And then, in cases where people want to make a difference, we can create a mechanism. But at least empower people to be able to build their homes. Don't criminalize them because they've just lost their homes. And the most important thing in this moment is that you're able to be recognized as a citizen who has the right to build, not as a client of any political party who will bully to allow you to build exceptionally, which is what we've seen happen to so many people.
But I wonder, though, if there's any opportunity for you to recommend a change in the law. Since you are the experts, can you pitch it to a member of parliament? Because obviously the law has to be presented by a member of parliament.
Yes.
Rather than the minister, it comes through the parliament.
Yes. So that's why I'm saying what I'm trying to say is that any law for a village will require more work than what we can do in 2 weeks. So we should, in 2 weeks, have Parliament pass a regulation to allow people to build their homes. Yeah. And we should work in villages to be able to, have these regulations. There is no way a small research lab, as mighty as we look from the American University of Beirut, and I have to say they're the most wonderful, most dedicated team, and really lucky to be here at AUB that we can actually have laws now for all the towns. But we can have a set of principles, to be followed.
Yes.
And that by any means,
and that incorporates, what you're talking about before.
And we're not alone in trying to do this.
No.
You just mentioned Abir and Serge, and there's many other colleagues as well who are equally keen on seeing this happen. So it can happen,
Yeah, that's, you're the minds, you're the brains, you're the visionaries of how it can be done, and you understand the law. So this is where, the government needs you. Okay, now we'll dive into the final segment and the funding the reconstruction. We know the Lebanese government, as you said, doesn't have the funds for reconstruction and is heavily relying on the international community to intervene. As I mentioned earlier, the new government has announced it will set up a transparent fund to manage the reconstruction. We're also aware that foreign money comes with foreign intervention or influence. In a report by the Institute of International Finance, they claimed Lebanon could unlock more than $12.5 billion if reforms took place. So far, we've seen Qatar pledge $100 million to support reconstruction. On this issue of foreign interference, first, following the 2006 war, countries that were involved in the reconstruction efforts imposed their models onto Lebanon. I know you touched on them. Mostly interested in quick reconstruction rather than considering the local landscape and heritage. For example, Qatar and Saudi Arabia sponsored the rebuilding of entire villages or neighbourhoods and built them themselves, leading to a lack of consistent reconstruction and where urban and heritage aspects were neglected. What should be done this time around in relation to the funding, and how would you address this issue of foreign interference?
To be fair, back in 2006, when advocates went to the Qatar Fund to point to the importance of heritage and to the fact that heritage homes needed more money to be fixed, they were quite sensitive to it, actually, more than anyone else. So I have to recognize that.
Good.
Now, that said, yes, I think that we are in a very different situation than 2006, because despite all the money that came from international agencies, there is no doubt that as far as the repair of individual homes goes, the main costs were covered by people who lost their homes. So people rebuild their homes, they get aid, it supports them, they put their labor, they put their investments, they get remittances from relatives. But in general, we haven't seen, this time it's going to be really different. And the reason why it's really different is because people lost their monies. In the banks, it's because many people had built their lifelong home using their investment, selling the one piece of land they had so that they can build a home, and they don't have other assets to build that nice home that they liked. So there's a huge question about who will give you all this money. Is someone willing to pay several $100,000 for a villa? Would Lebanon take a loan to give someone to repair for a house that expensive? Is it fair? That would reproduce inequalities. So there are difficult questions that cannot be answered very quickly right now. That said, we can start with the infrastructure, and that infrastructure certainly needs to be centralized. We certainly hope that it would be in the form of aid and not loans for a bankrupt country. The conditions on having discipline and reform, I think, are great. What conditions, what reform, in what form, I think that a lot of this will have to be negotiated, because there's a certain prescriptive approach to the IMF that I'm not entirely confident. I'm not a financial expert. I'm not entirely confident is unanimously endorsed. What we know is that most of the costs so far have been paid by the lower and the middle income groups. So it's high time that the bank owners, the shareholders are held accountable, and so that we can get out of the financial default and the bankruptcy where we're in. And this will be absolutely necessary for the country to be able to build an economy. It's a no-brainer. But I certainly hope that that fund that they're talking about starts with infrastructure, and that it begins to allow to create the framework where those who can are staying with relatives, with friends, are able to stay in the villages where they are and the towns in which they are. And then the second step will be to find a mechanism to support people in rebuilding their homes with equitable means.
Well, on that topic of the fund, the report said that Gulf countries, apart from Qatar, there are the Gulf countries, the IMF, the World Bank, and European countries could contribute $12.5 billion if reforms are implemented. Firstly, is this a good deal for Lebanon, though? Should Lebanon leverage these relationships to rebuild the country? And if so, what is the cost to the country if it does? I know that you're not a financial or economic expert, but would these countries and institutions, what do they want in return? Is it contracts, reconstruction contracts, political influence, trade deals? In the past, because we see that all over the world, they destroy, wars happen. It's a great opportunity for foreign countries to come in, rebuild, put their contractors in. And we've seen that in Lebanon too.
Let's start with the aspiration. The aspirational is accountability.
Yes.
Right? So someone is responsible for this destruction. There's widespread evidence, and we've documented this in the Beirut Urban Lab. People can check our website, that the bombing in the ways it happened was indiscriminate, that it was in violation of international law in proximity to schools and hospitals, which is in violation of international human rights. So there is clearly a party that needs to be accountable, and that's the party that bombed schools, hospitals, civilian infrastructures. As I mentioned in the beginning, 27% of the schools in the south, 82% of the electricity. This is not by any stretch of the imagination a terrorist infrastructure. This is a people's infrastructure. So someone destroyed this infrastructure, that's Israel. Someone donated the bombs to Israel. Not only sold, but donated. And that's the United States, we know this. That's the EU, particularly Germany, then Italy. We know the countries. The reports are everywhere. So I think we should begin there. My aspiration is that there needs to be accountability, and those who have destroyed should be paying for it. And in this game, Lebanon is on the receiving end. It doesn't mean that we're not responsible for our own bankruptcy, for the money we borrowed, for our misgovernance. That we need to be fully in charge of, and we need to repair, and we need to hold also internally accountable the bankers, the politicians, and anyone who was a decision maker and continues to be a decision maker, taking the same decisions and allowing the perpetuation of our bankruptcy and our lack of recovery. So that, for me, would actually be the right thing to do for the people of Lebanon.
Ideally.
Yes.
America will never hold Israel accountable. The impunity that it's allowed to exist since inception or before.
Look, the arc of history doesn't naturally go towards justice. We know that, right? The history of the United States is a clear, one clear sign. Australia too, for that matter. So I am not going to say that I'm hopeful that the arc of history always goes towards justice. But what I will say is that I have no doubt that globally, the word community and people know who is responsible here. And that public opinion everywhere is actually quite clear, even in the United States, about who was the predator in Gaza and in the West Bank today, and even in Lebanon. Because the war did not start on October 7, nor on October 8.
But they'll say it's all Hezbollah's fault, and Hezbollah started by retaliating.
That is easy to say for decision makers who want to evade the decision. But for those of us who grew up in South Lebanon, we know perfectly well that Israel occupied Lebanon in 1978 and that Hezbollah was founded in the mid-80s. So action-reaction, Hezbollah is ugly, it's militarized, yes. That's what a militarized occupation produces. It does not produce art and creativity and things that you want to see. It doesn't produce the protection of heritage. It produces militias that are patriarchal, yes, right? It produces an acceptance of violence as a means of resistance. It produces eventually a demonization of the other, and prevents the possibility of imagining a being together. Because there's absolutely no problem in having Jewish neighbors.
Yes.
But we want to have Jewish neighbors who are part of our region, who are our equals, with whom we can talk and with whom we can empathize that Europe has also been horrible to us, not only to them. But we don't want a white supremacist ideology to be actually ruling us, because it doesn't want to live with us. It wants to erase us. It never came to be with us. And that's the problem we have. We have a problem with that ideology. And this is where Hezbollah needs to be understood. So once we accept that, we can say that maybe there will be accountability, actually, because the global community understands it. Because the global community today can see the duplicity in the decision vis-à-vis Ukraine that now has been abandoned by both Israel and the United States.
Yes.
It's a crazy vote we saw a couple of days ago in the United Nations, but it falls within the logic of things. And so I am hopeful there, actually. Not maybe now, immediately, but on the long run, I am hopeful. I'm hopeful when I see young Jewish activists in the United States protesting. I am hopeful when I see that in Germany, after the Palestinians, it's the German Jews who are at the forefront of the protest. So I'm very hopeful. After that, I will say, okay, so what is the mechanism if this is not going to be the way to compensate people? Where I would hope that we can demand from solidarity from our Arab, not demand, ask for solidarity from the Arab countries because they've been generous to Lebanon, but also that we demand some support from the EU that has proposed to give us loans, but I think that in all fairness, given that they've given weapons to Israel, it would be good that we can get also some aid. We've already paid the loans for this infrastructure that was just destroyed. Lebanon didn't have the country. Most of this infrastructure was built with loans. We haven't even returned. So to ask us to take even more loans is going to be really difficult. Ideally, if this doesn't happen, and if we're going to take loans, we should definitely prioritize everything that's productive and prioritize starting with building an economy, creating the infrastructure that will support the agriculture, the formation of industries, so that we can begin to build an economy And that's not what we did in the last 30 years. And we should remember that real estate speculation is not productive.
No. But all of these loans, or the possibility of loans, are predicated on the fact that the Lebanese government institutes reforms, which the IMF and World Bank have been asking for the last 5 years with the previous government we had, and they were reluctant to do that because it would mean losing their power.
I would think that this cabinet will have to do something. Right? I mean, look at the profile of the ministers. Your Minister of Economy, your Prime Minister, his Vice President, your Minister of Culture. You have heavyweights there with vision and a solid understanding that you can't become a pariah state and that you have to implement reforms. And that and I also have faith that they're smart enough not to just be dictated. We know that countries, Pakistan, Argentina, these countries have negotiated more than 10 IMF packages, and they go into cycles of bankruptcy, but in and out, in and out. We also need to avoid that. So I don't put my full faith in the IMF. What I find, though, extraordinary is that we are likely the only country on the face of earth where the IMF is to the left of our government and was more concerned about the poverty that was being created by our meltdown than our own government.
Yeah, previous.
Yes, our previous government. And
Yes.
so I think that it's insane to say that, but still, like to hope for the IMF sounds like it's crazy. But at the same time, I hope that we'll be able to negotiate something that will put us in a better place. And I think we have some of the brightest minds to do it.
And just finally, you raise a very good point. We have a great cabinet. We have tremendous hope in this cabinet. We never believed we would get this standard of quality of people in there. But at the end of the day, isn't the parliament the one that approves the laws? And that's where we're still at the moment. But we're hoping that, of course, the change and reformists within the parliament, the 128 MPs, we're hoping that more people within those parties, we've shifted with sectarian parties approving Joseph Aoun and approving Nawaf Salam. So hopefully they see it's in their interest to also approve reforms. But I guess it'll come down to what that looks like for them. Banking laws, going after the bankers, it will impact them. And I guess it's too soon to tell, but that's the journey ahead for this new government. They're only in for about 14, 15 months before the next parliamentary elections. There's a lot on their plate, but we're here to talk about reconstruction and the immediate need of the Lebanese people whose homes have been destroyed. And it's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much for enlightening everyone with your incredible knowledge. Thank you, Mona.
Thank you so much for making the time for this. I sincerely appreciate it.
Our absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Real Talk and experiencing firsthand the real stories told by real people. I hope you found value and meaning and encourage you to subscribe to my YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Your ongoing financial support is vital to our ability to continue delivering these stories, so please remember to click on the donate button in the description, giving only what you can afford. I spent my whole life giving my time, money and skill to serve human rights and social justice causes, and I know it's not easy to keep giving selflessly. But this work is important because the mainstream media has failed to live up to their obligations. So we need to step up, speak up, or we're no better than them. I believe by tuning in to this podcast, you are someone who wants to know the facts and the truth, so you can independently decide what to believe and what not to. My job is to deliver that information. Yours is to place a value on it. Whatever you decide is humbly welcome. Thanks again, and see you on the next episode of Real Talk.